Hi, I'm Julie Escher. In this video, I'm talking about the needlepoint technique, which is basically an extension of outlining and flooding, where I lay a very tiny grid with an outlining icing and then come back and flood the holes to create a pattern that looks a lot like needlepoint. First, I'm going to show you how I created this sort of Argyle pattern on top of my stuffed stocking cookies, which I talked about in another video. But you needn't necessarily do a stocking cookie. The needlepoint pattern can be applied to just about anything. These are lids of a heart box cookie that I talk about in another video, and the interior here is also done with the needlepoint technique. It's relatively time consuming, so if you've got a lot of patience, this would be the technique for you. If you don't, then you might want to find a quicker way to decorate the cookies. But I love it, and it has a really show-stopping effect, and technically it's not that difficult to do. So the end product is going to be the stocking the Argyle pattern on this stocking cookie. So let's get started. Basically all you'll need are two consistencies of royal icing, a relatively thick outlining consistency to do the grid, and a relatively thin consistency, what I call the consistency of beadwork, to fill the little holes in between the grid. And I've got those all pre-mixed. I'm going to start to lay the grid, again using the outlining consistency, and I always like to test it on my work surface. I'm working to make sure it's flowing properly and it looks good. I like to work with a parchment cone because I have a barely perceptible hole cut in the tip and I can get a really, really fine grid this way. If you're not accustomed to working with a parchment cone, you might want to work with you'll want to work with a pastry bag with a metal tip, but you want to choose a very, very small tip, like a 0 or less. So if you want a fine grid, otherwise you can do this with a bigger opening in your tip. You'll just have a clunkier looking pattern, which could be fine for certain designs, but I want this one very delicate. I want these lines very, very straight, so I'm going to be steadying my arm on the counter and also steadying the tip of my cone. I have a whole video about how to make and handle parchment cones, so you might want to jump on over to there after you listen to this one to see how to work with these if you're not accustomed to it. So the first step is to start by laying lines parallel to each other. For this pattern, I lay them about 1/8 to 1/16 inch apart. It's a very, very fine grid, and as I said, if you want to speed up the process or you want a different look, you can lay them further apart. You'll just have a wider looking pattern. And I pipe very slowly at this point because I don't want to break my lines. If you break the line, you have to lift it, and for that I would use my handy trussing needle to lift off any mistakes. But with this particular technique, it's nice not to break the lines because it's hard to lift them especially once you've got the lines going down perpendicular to these. So I'm just going to continue to pipe all the way down this length of the stocking. The other thing I should point out is if you're new to needlepoint, and even if you're not, I like to pipe a light color on a dark cookie, either directly on the gingerbread in this case, or on a dark icing, because the grid shows up. And after a while, you're going to be going cross-eyed if you're piping a light color on a light color. So bear that in mind. I purposely did this way. And I'm just eyeballing the distance. I'm letting the icing fall rather than dragging it on the tip of the cookie. That way the icing falls much straighter. If you really try to draw with the icing, you're going to get a really wiggly line. I'm also starting off the cookie here just because there's always a little bit of curl at the icing to start, and I don't want that blob on the cookie. So I tend to start off the edge of the cookie and get it flowing straight, and then continue on over like so. And again, these are about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch apart. I only know that because at one point I measured it. Before this dries, I can then just knock off the overflow so I don't have that hanging off the edge of the cookie. And I would continue in this way, going all the way down to the end, which I'm going to do here. And then I'm going to come back and pipe lines perpendicular to these to finish off the grid. So let me keep going here and finish off the lines going in the other direction. Okay, I'm back. I've been busy. As you can see, I've filled in a lot of lines perpendicular to the others, and I'm just going to close off the end of the stocking where I've got a few more lines to lay down. And here, as I mentioned earlier, it's especially important to move slowly so you don't break that line, because it's much harder to pick up these broken line and start over once it's on top of the other lines going across. I should also point out that I like to pipe with a certain orientation of the cookie. You'll see me rotating it around, but it would be much harder for me to pipe this way and fill in the lines this way because my hand is covering the grid I already piped, and I'm using what I already piped to gauge how far apart I should space the lines. If I rotate the cookie this way, I can see the spacing of the other lines. I have much better visibility of what I've already piped, which allows me to really use that as a visual guide for spacing the remaining lines. If the lines aren't parallel, when you start putting the looser beadwork icing in to create the pattern, it won't look as uniform. It'll look a little more wonky. So just do your best with that. And again, the keys are really just having a steady hand, letting the icing flow on its own. Don't drag it on the cookie surface. Let it fall into place. And using the other lines you've piped as your visual guide. And I think I can fit one more here at the end. And we've got our grid finished. I've got some big blobs of icing, relatively big anyway. They're actually pretty microscopic here, but I don't like them. So I'll knock them off, clean them up a little bit before they dry with my trussing needle. Okay, so now we're ready to come in and create this pattern. If you're a beginner with needlepoint, it's best to have a repeatable pattern because it's easier to count it off than something that's kind of random. And to fill these holes, I like to work with an icing. We'll start with the white. I'm going to start by laying the white diamonds in. I like to work with an icing of beadwork consistency that creates a nice rounded dot on its own. It's relatively loose. Typically I add about 1.5 to 2 teaspoons water, I believe. You can check the consistency adjustments on my website. So if it leaves a peak, it's too thick and you might want to thin it out. Okay, one thing you can do is draw out your pattern on graph paper, which I've done here. Typically I don't do that. Typically I wing it. But for the purposes of this template or pattern will be available on my website, so you can actually study this and follow this as you're piping. But basically my diamonds are formed by 5 white dots going up and 5 coming down, and I'm just going to count them off as I go. You can count off literally the spaces or eyeball it, and I am going to eyeball it. I think this is about the midpoint, and the reason I start in the midpoint is, again, so that it's centered. If I were to start off to the side, you know, I might have, here I've got a nice diamond squarely in the center, and it just looks symmetric from either side. In some designs that might not be important, but here I like it to look that way. I think this is about center here. Again, you could count them off to be exactly precise. And I'm just going to squeeze in my dot. The other thing with filling the grid, you can move really fast if your pattern is mostly on the diagonal. If I were going to fill in a grid right next to one I just filled, I'd have to move a little more slowly. In fact, I don't like to fill adjacent grids one after the other because the icing can overflow each of the grids and flow into each other, and the beads look much less separate that way. So if you do have a pattern where the dots are side by side, we have a couple of instances of it here. You just want to let the first drop dry a little bit before you put the next one right next to it. Count it down 5, and then I'm going to count down another 4. This is one of these things I like to do with minimal distraction and noise, because if you lose count and fill the wrong grid, then your pattern, you know, is messed up after all this work. There are ways to recover that. If I've misfilled an opening, which I haven't here, you can gently, you know, knock out the icing while it's still wet with your trussing needle. Okay, so my next diamond starts 2 over from the next one, so I want to count 2 over and then just continue like so. I did do for last Christmas a cardinal cookie, which wasn't a symmetric pattern, so I had to be even more attentive. But what I did was I based it on an existing needlepoint pattern. So they're needlepoint patterns you can download online. Let me do one more row of diamonds underneath, and then we'll come back and put in the red and green accents, and then you can begin to see a pattern emerge. Okay, so we've got 2 rows of white diamonds down, a small error there. Well, I'm going to show you how I would correct this. I'm going to just try to dig out enough of the icing that I can see the brown behind it. I'm going to come back in now and accent with the green. For the green, I've just followed outline of the white all the way around. Sometimes I will clean the tip of the cone off before I pipe the next dot, if there's a long tail on the end, because I just don't want it to hit the white dots that are already down there. And I'd like to pipe as vertically as possible. I was getting a little horizontal there because that way and be as over the top of the cookie as possible, because that way I'm making sure I'm filling the grid fully and not overflowing into another grid. Steadying the tip of my cone with my fingertip. And I'm actually, when I'm filling the hole, I'm above the grid. I'm not really touching the grid because I don't want to break the grid. That's another important point. You can begin to see a pattern emerging here. Completed 2 rows of white and green. Of course, I'd continue all the way down to complete the Argyle pattern. And then the last step is coming back for this particular pattern is to come back in with the red. And I just used a few little red accents, basically a little quartet of dots in between the white ones in the center. So we'll just fill those in. I actually did a slightly different pattern than the one I have to the left. I've got a big row of in between, which we can also fill in if we'd like. So I did deviate a little bit on this one. What I'm going to do now is come back in. You could leave this the way it is with a lot of space in between, but I want to come in and add a little bit more white detail just to finish it off. So I'm going to do a sort of a modified diamond in the middle. I'm going to count down 3 from the green and come over 4. And I think that'll center in this spot if I'm lucky. So it's going to end with a kind of a flat rather than with a point. And I'm going to continue all the way across. One thing that occurred to me, people sometimes ask when you're laying the grid, how long do you have to wait between laying the lines in one direction versus the other direction? Because I'm working with a relatively thick icing, it's going to dry pretty quickly. And also because it's white on white, I really don't have to allow any drying time. By the time I complete that first set of vertical lines, the ones underneath will be virtually dry, certainly dry enough for me to lay the ones on top without them blending or bleeding into each other. So really no drying time. And again, by the time I'm done laying the horizontal lines, most of the white grid is pretty dry. So I'm not even waiting much before I add green or red, even though it's green or red on white. This one actually ends with a point because I have a flaw. This is what happens if you get off kilter. This one was off count. So this one ends with a point, whereas those ones don't. So beware. You want to really pay attention when you're doing this and make sure you correct things as you go. It's easy to change out patterns just by tweaking a few things. Okay, so I just finished that row of dots. And you have a couple of options here. You could continue and go all out for the holidays, as I have with this Christmas stocking, and fill the entire grid. You could leave it like this, or you could just map out a much smaller portion of the stocking, maybe just this midsection, and do what I did there. So you have a couple different options to either really to speed up the process if you're short on time during the holidays. And these aren't necessarily just holiday-only cookies. As a reminder, you can do these for any seasonal project whatsoever. I've got a Valentine's project coming up in another video where I talk about needlepoint work on those cookies as well. But again, if you want to go all out, here's the full-blown Argyle pattern on this particular stocking. Till next video, live sweetly.